everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the religious hippie, and I host the podcast A Catholic's Perspective. Join me every 2 weeks as I release episodes targeted towards helping young Catholics navigate their ever-changing secular world while staying strong in their faith. Whether you are a Catholic or not, all are welcome here. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to tune in. You can find A Catholic's Perspective on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope to see you there. Bye!
Hello and welcome to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm your host, Father Daniel Duplantis. I'm a martial artist, musician, airman, and a priest of the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. One of my other passions in life is teaching, especially teaching about the Catholic faith. Catholicism is a very deep faith. Jesus himself told Peter to put out into the deep for a catch. The most significant answers to life's most important questions often lie deep beneath the surface. Many people have questions about their faith. Through this podcast, my aim is to explore these questions and encounter incredible people along the way. Their stories show that God is constantly at work in our lives every single day, sometimes in the ordinary and sometimes in the extraordinary. Some of the topics treated in this podcast may be sensitive or controversial, but their discussion holds the key to truly living as God created us to live, which is to say that He created us to live in authentic freedom, loving Him above all else. Thank you for joining me on this journey of faith, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Karate Priest Podcast. Today I'm going to be flying solo, and today I wanted to talk about a really fun topic that I've been doing some research into lately for a mission here back home. But it's something that I really love as a priest and as a liturgist talking about, because I think this is one of the most brilliant points of not just the Mass itself, but the Roman Missal 3rd edition that we're using. And so today's topic is what we call the Eucharistic Prayers. Now, if you think about what happens at Mass, we have the liturgy of the Word, so we have the readings, the homily, then we have the offertory and the preparation of the gifts. And immediately after the offertory, we get to the Holy, Holy, Holy. We get to really the climax of the Mass, which is the consecration. And so when we get to the consecration, this is where we have now several options for the Eucharistic prayer. But before I get into details on these prayers, I kind of want to look a little bit more at the history. If we think back to the Mass before Vatican II, some of us, some of our parents and grandparents maybe grew up with the Latin Mass. I know there's a lot of young Catholics today who still love to attend Latin Masses, and certainly I've celebrated my fair share of them. In the Latin Mass, what I've noticed is there's only one Eucharistic prayer, which was so strange for me learning to celebrate the Latin Mass, because I grew up in a Novus Ordo parish. And so I was used to having these different Eucharistic prayers. But in the Latin Mass, there was only one, called the Roman Canon. And it didn't matter what feast day it was, what the occasion was. If you were doing a Mass, you celebrated using the Roman Canon as the Eucharistic prayer. It was the only Eucharistic prayer you could use. It was said in Latin, and it was also said in the low voice by the priest. And so the people couldn't hear, except for certain parts that were said out loud for the sake of the congregation being able to kind of know, okay, so this is where Father is right now in the prayer. Other than that, it was said just to the priest himself. And so what happened is with Vatican II, a very key part of Vatican II was the rediscovery of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of patristic writings in the decades preceding the council. And so when you get to the council, there's this rediscovery and this desire to reintegrate a lot of patristic teaching and patristic theology. This is going back to the very first centuries of the church. And the Eucharistic prayers were no different. It was certainly a part of that kind of philosophy behind the council. And so there are several Eucharistic prayers that were kind of rediscovered, and then some that were actually kind of compiled more recently. And so what Vatican II did was give us this set of options of Eucharistic prayer to adjust to what we call the principle of progressive solemnity. And what that means is that for different feast days, just as in the Latin Mass, you'd have like first class, second class, third class feast. In the Novus Ordo, you can adjust the level of solemnity in the Eucharistic prayer itself, whether it's longer or shorter or focusing on something different. And so it allows the Mass to really be adapted in a way that's far different than it was in the Latin Mass. And so with Vatican II, there was a big desire for the Eucharistic prayer to help people understand the mystery of redemption. It wanted to be understood. The council wanted people to actually hear the Eucharistic prayers, to enter into it. Again, this whole concept we hear of Vatican II of full active and conscious participation in the liturgy. And so with that, they wanted the climax of the Mass to be understood in such a way that people could enter into it fully, consciously, and actively. And so with that, in addition to the Roman canon being translated into English, or in the vernacular in general, 3 new Eucharistic prayers were also added to the Missal. And so they have the same wording for the words of institution. So this is my body, this is my blood. That's the same words of institution for all of these Eucharistic prayers. But the other 3 main ones, in addition to the Roman canon, all have a little bit other focuses. Now, there's also, 6 more Eucharistic prayers besides these 4 primary ones. There's 2 for reconciliation, and there's 4 for various needs that can be adapted to different circumstances. But really today, I'm going to talk about the 4 main ones. So you had the Roman canon, which was used for most of the history of the church. And it's the longest one. It's the most detailed one, talking about the mystery of redemption. And especially with its focus on the intercession of the saints, talking about the apostles, talking about the first martyrs of the Roman Catholic Church. And so a lot of these figures appear in there. But then we have these other Eucharistic prayers that came up in the wake of the council. One of these is actually older than the Roman canon. If you look at Eucharistic Prayer 2 in the Roman Missal, it's short, but it's old. Because at the time, you have to remember in the early church, there were no such things as missals. The first priest, the apostles, and then for the first couple centuries, priests did not have uniform books on how to celebrate the liturgy. From what we have documents that relate the teachings of the church fathers, it said that priests, for the most part, prayed a Eucharistic prayer according to their own ability. It was kind of just made up, with the essential elements being the words of institution. And so with that, Eucharistic prayer is old, but it's short. And it's based on the Eucharistic prayer of Hippolytus of Rome, originating from about 215 AD. And so it has a very simple clarity in its prayer of thanksgiving. It is extremely short, and especially considering that immediately from the Sanctus, it jumps right into the words of institution with just a couple of sentences. And so this one really isn't intended for Sundays, but oftentimes as a priest, I'll use Eucharistic Prayer 2 for what we call ferial days, like days of ordinary time, weekdays, where there's really nothing going on. And so it kind of keeps the focus very simple. As opposed to Eucharistic Prayer 1, the Roman canon, which is the longest one, I'll tend to use that one for like solemnities, Christmas, Easter, even going to the point of being able to chant the Roman canon for Christmas and Easter masses. So if you've ever been to one of my midnight masses at my cathedral, you may have heard me chant the Roman canon, which, by the way, is another development from the council as regards the Eucharistic prayers, is not only are they now recited in the vernacular and out loud, one change from the Latin Mass to the current Mass is the fact that the Eucharistic prayer can now also be fully chanted, which I think is awesome. For someone like me who was a music major before seminary, I love the fact that I can chant almost the entire Mass at this point because of what the council did with all the parts of the Mass, which is to write a chant text, or to at least give you the notations of how to format your chants if you want to chant the entirety of the Mass. And so we have that now. The next Eucharistic prayer after 2, Eucharistic Prayer 3, was rediscovered, really rediscovered the ideal of what a Roman Eucharistic prayer should be. It kind of takes the best of all the Eucharistic prayers that were discovered and combines them into one. It's considered a shorter version of the Roman canon. So it has a lot of the same themes, but for this one, it also has a variable preface. So the preface, if you think of the Mass when we say, the Lord be with you, lift up your hearts, let us give thanks to the Lord our God. That's the beginning of the preface. Now, Eucharistic Prayer 2 has its own preface that you can use, but you can also use other prefaces as well. Eucharistic Prayer 3 has no proper preface. So you have to find some other preface for the use of that day. But the canon itself is invariable. It does not change. So Eucharistic Prayer 3, what I like to do for this one is to use it on Sundays, specifically like, your regular Sundays of ordinary time, to kind of shorten Eucharistic Prayer 1, but at the same time, it's more solemn than Eucharistic Prayer 2, because Sundays are considered solemnities. And so I love using Eucharistic Prayer 3 for that. Eucharistic Prayer 3 is also good to use for saints' memorials, because it's the only Eucharistic prayer where you can insert the name of a particular saint. Another reason I like to use it for Sundays, because that's our parish masses. And so I'll often insert the name here at my cathedral of St. Francis de Sales. And so it's a good Eucharistic prayer to use to celebrate the memorials of saints, specifically to ask for that saint's intercession. The next Eucharistic prayer, number 4, is probably my favorite, to be honest. And the reason for that is because, one, it's old, but at the same time, it's a bridge in tradition from east to west. So Eucharistic Prayer 4 is based on the anaphora of St. John of the West Syrian Byzantine Rite. And so if you've ever been to a Byzantine liturgy, this Eucharistic prayer really models those. And so it's centered around its description of salvation history after the Holy, Holy, Holy. So it kind of goes into a summary of salvation history. And so because of this, Eucharistic Prayer 4 does have a proper preface that you have to use if you're using Eucharistic Prayer 4. Because again, it's in the same theme of salvation history. So once you get to the Lord be with you, lift up your hearts, let us give thanks to the Lord our God, that part you have to use from Eucharistic Prayer 4 itself. So because of that, Eucharistic Prayer 4 can only be used at certain times of the year. So you can use it for ferial days or days where a proper preface is not prescribed. So it's a little more limited in its usage, but it's a gorgeous prayer and certainly has that kind of Eastern Byzantine flair to it, which I think is so beautiful, especially because, in a lot of Byzantine art, you see like images of salvation history in the iconography and things like that. So I love Eucharistic Prayer 4. So in addition to that, there's 6 other Eucharistic prayers, 2 for reconciliation, and I tend to use those primarily during Lent and Advent because those are penitential seasons. So what I'll normally do is I'll use Eucharistic Prayer for Reconciliation number 1 for the Sundays of Advent or Lent, because it's a little bit longer, a little bit more in depth. And then I'll use Eucharistic Prayer 2 for the weekdays of Advent and Lent, again, to kind of establish that principle of progressive solemnity. And then on top of that, again, I love these practical reasons for these Eucharistic prayers, right? Again, the council is trying to get people to be able to engage in the liturgy more fully, actively, and consciously. Because the reality was, and I have parishioners who say, Father, they said, when I was growing up, people would pray their rosary or read their Bibles during the highest point of the Mass. He said no one understood what was going on. And so what they wanted to do was to allow it to be understood. And again, I love the fact that you can now sing these Eucharistic prayers. And so that gives you such a range from a very simple Eucharistic prayer to just being recited on a weekday to having like Christmas and Easter masses where the Roman canon is chanted. And you're able to really find that range of solemnity now with the fact that the highest point of the Mass is now being said for the entire congregation to hear. And at the same time, it's being sung. And so that's the Eucharistic prayers in a nutshell. I highly encourage people for practical purposes to get a daily missal for Mass and to use that missal as you're following along with the Mass to simply read the Eucharistic prayer along with the priest. I think a lot of people, sometimes we hear the Eucharistic prayers, but then because we hear them so much, we kind of zone out at that point. And then we wait for the sound of the bells at the elevations to kind of bring us back in. But I encourage people to get a daily missal, or sometimes the missalettes provided by the church will have the Eucharistic prayers in the order of Mass. And so I encourage you, try to figure out what Eucharistic prayer the priest is using. See if you notice patterns with your parish priest and what Eucharistic prayer he uses. But follow along with them, because there's a lot of beautiful and poetic wording and just beautiful theology in these Eucharistic prayers. Again, it's the highest point of the Mass. And so with that, my encouragement is, again, go get a daily missal, follow along with the Eucharistic prayers. And also, very importantly, because there are parts of the Eucharistic prayer that have congregational responses now, specifically the Sanctus and the memorial acclamation, if the priest sings them, please, by all means, sing it back. Make sure that you actually participate in the Mass in the way it's designed. In many ways, it's designed to be sung. And so if the priest sings these dialogues, please do us a favor as well. Sing them back. We love hearing you sing these parts back to us. So that's it for today. A short episode, but kind of some good stuff just to take and practically enter into the Mass. And so we will see you guys next time. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Karate Priest. If you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and like The Karate Priest on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're ever in South Louisiana, come visit me at the Cathedral of St. Francis de Sales in Houma. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can also email me at thekaratepriest@gmail.com. Your questions are welcomed and may be used in future episodes. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down on you and remain with you forever. Amen.
A quest is a search for something. And every week, the Quest podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. I'm your host, Todd Fisher. Join me in this thought-provoking and inspiring podcast of discovery. Find us anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure and visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.